Hey friends, welcome to Hearth of Hymonia and welcome back to the more than 1,000 of you that are now subscribed here. That's really cool that more than 1,000 people are interested in what I have to say about the ancient world, so that's pretty awesome. Thank you for being here, and I hope you continue to get something out of these videos, and as always, if you have requests or ideas, drop them in the comments. I'd love to know what you guys are kind of interested in. So for those of you who have not seen my community post, I've been away for a while now. I spent the last several months planning my wedding and then getting married. We traveled quite a bit in preparation for that, so I've been away for some time, but I am back for the foreseeable future. We're going to be talking all things belief in antiquity as usual, and with spooky season coming up, I'll be kind of going back towards what I started the channel talking about, which is anything to do with ancient magic. So if you like that kind of thing and you're not yet subscribed, feel free to do that, and yeah, it's going to be a fun time. So I'm very happy to be back. Today we are talking about the god Hephaestus, also known as Vulcan, although I hope throughout the video to make it clear that there were two separate traditions here. Typically we think of Greek gods being adopted by the Romans and then giving them new names and stuff like that. That's not really what happened. In the case of Hephaestus, there was a Greek tradition and a Roman tradition, and as contact between the two cultures increased and grew more frequent, these two gods became merged. So throughout the video, I will make it clear about which of the two that I'm talking about when I'm talking about things like cult worship, but when it comes to mythology, I'll just be kind of using Hephaestus as the default because we have a lot of Greek sources for the mythology itself. There's a lot to talk about, and I'm just gonna get right into it. So I think the most fundamental thing to understand about this god, Hephaestus or Vulcan, is conceptually what fire means to the Greeks and Romans, and to humans in general. Fire is one of those primordial elements, right? It's one of those very fundamental principles of how we connect with the world around us. And it has kind of a dual nature to it. On the one hand, it can be really destructive. We've seen that recently with the just awful wildfires that have been happening in different places around the world, Maui, Greece, Canada. But it also is a productive element. It has the power to create or help in creation. It has a generative quality to it. It can power things. It also kind of literally gives life to humans through our ability to use it to cook. And we can also make things from it. We can make metal tools to help us. That's a major theme of Hephaestus and Vulcan. Hephaestus and Vulcan really do represent both sides of fire. He's a god not only of what we can produce with fire, so all of the crafts that use fire, metalworking, even cooking to a certain extent, but also he represents this destructive quality. And this is really emphasized in early worship of Vulcan in the Roman context. On both the archaeological side of things and the literary side, Vulcan is one of those early gods that is worshipped even from a pre-Roman time in central Italy. And so when Rome is first getting started, Vulcan is one of those gods whose worship is initiated during the period of the monarchy. The area of Rome that was sacred to Vulcan is a place that's just called the Vulcanal. It is this sacred area. It's not a temple, but it's a sort of a precinct that is designated for the cultivation of Vulcan. It's located at the base of the Capitoline Hill, which would become the Roman Forum later on, and so it would be in the center of public life. But when it was first made, it probably wasn't actually near anywhere where people were living. Supposedly, it was set up by this guy named Titus Tatius, who was a Sabine who at one point was co-ruler of Rome. So we're still talking about the period of the monarchy, kind of like the middle monarchy after the Sabine War, that this area was dedicated and began to function as a site of Vulcan's worship. And in these early days, Vulcan wasn't as fully developed a figure as he would become later on. The primary function of the shrine, at least during the monarchy, was most likely to propitiate the god in order to keep him happy so that they would be protected from fire. Fire, as we said, has this incredible ability to destroy everything in its path. It's still dangerous now. In antiquity, this would have been even more so. So part of the cultivation of Vulcan was to make sure that people were protected from fire. Both their homes, which were often made out of wood, so not flame resistant at all, and also in the fields. Losing an entire season's crop to a fire is not only a financial disaster for whoever's farm it is, but it's also a major food shortage crisis for the general population. So it would have been very, very important for the Romans in these early days to keep themselves safe from fire, and that was the primary function of the shrine of Vulcan at that time. As Rome grew up and developed, other buildings started to be placed around it, and it kind of became a feature of the center of town, even though it had been kind of outward before. It was rededicated under Augustus in the year 9 CE, and then later rededicated again by Domitian. Now, by Domitian's time, the function of Vulcan had also developed, so now he was representing much, much, much more than just this destructive power of fire. Nevertheless, part of the motivation for Domitian's rededication of the temple, at least according to this inscription that we have, I'll put it up on the screen here, part of the motivation for Domitian was precisely this early form of worship, to placate the god in order to keep Rome safe from fire. And Domitian's reasoning was that because the Temple of Vulcan was getting encroached on by all of these other buildings and it was kind of not properly looked after, that was potentially the cause of the Great Fire of Rome under Nero, which is just bonkers to me because typically when you think of the Great Fire, you think this was Nero blaming the Christians, maybe Nero said it himself, who knows, there's like all these theories out there, and that's one that I hadn't heard until I found this inscription when I was preparing for this video, so this is like super fun for me. But anyway, so from the very beginning, at least through Domitian and probably much after him, the temple was in use, maybe not continuous upkeep, but it was at least functioning as a temple of Vulcan for the entire time. Worship of Vulcan and recognition of Vulcan was also part of the Romans' regular religious calendar. They had an annual festival dedicated to the god. It was called the Vulcanalia, spelled either with a VU or VO, depending. And it actually just passed. It was on August 23rd every single year. Now, for those of you who are like, wait a second, why does that date sound kind of familiar? Or why do I feel like I should be thinking about that date? August 24th was the traditional date that was given to the eruption of Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples. And Vulcan, you can just tell by his name, is a god of volcanoes. We'll get there in a minute. Now, this is not the going theory for when Vesuvius actually erupted in modern archaeological terms, but this was the date that was traditionally given for this eruption, which would have been the day after the Vulcanalia. That's not why this festival was on that day, that's just a coincidence, but how wild is that? So the Vulcanalia took place at the end of August, This is the time when Rome was most vulnerable to damage from fire, especially because it was the harvest season. Like I was talking about, it was really, really important at this time of year, especially to keep Vulcan happy, so that's why the festival took place at that time. The customs of this festival are not my favorite. The main thing that people would do is they would build a massive bonfire and then make a sacrifice into the bonfire. And what they would sacrifice is live fish and live small animals, just throwing them into the fire, supposedly in place of humans. I would not recommend doing this if you are planning to incorporate Roman festivals into your regular practice. Eating a meal cooked over a fire would be a great substitute for this, but from a sort of philosophical standpoint, this is a very powerful sacrifice. It's somehow stronger because the sacrifice is a live sacrifice. And it's also direct. If Vulcan is the god of fire, because if you think about sacrifice, hold on, I'm gonna go on a tangent here. If you think about sacrifices, like the mechanism of how the sacrifice was supposed to get to the deity that it was going to, basically the logic was, most of the time you would burn whatever parts of the animal, usually the things that were not good for humans to eat, like the bones and the fat and stuff like that, you would burn that and it would waft up in the form of smoke and scent up towards the heavens where the gods were, and it would quote unquote create an aroma that was pleasing to the gods, right? So they would consume it in that way. A sacrifice to Vulcan by throwing something onto a fire is kind of like a direct consumption by the god, right? Does that make sense? Let me know if that makes sense, because that feels like that means something. And then there were some other things that happened during the festival. It's a possibility that people hung their clothes or fabric out in the sun during this time. The sun obviously is a ball of fire. There's also a possibility that there's a connection between Vulcan and the sun. This is supported by the mythology as well. In the story of the Gigantomachy, which is the story of the battle between the gods and the giants, Hephaestus gets himself into some trouble and he's saved by the sun god Helios. And to thank him, Hephaestus, in his capacity as a craftsman god, actually makes the 4-horse chariot that the sun drives across the sky each day. And then Pliny the Younger talks about one more custom that his uncle used to do, which was that starting with the Vulcanalia, that was when he would use candles to continue his work at night after the sun had set. This is sort of a sign that the days are growing shorter and we're going to have to do a lot of work by candlelight going forward, but also it's another way to bring Vulcan into the home by using fire on these holy days. So these were the annual customs of this festival, the Vulcanalia. There weren't always games, but Augustus did hold games one year in the year 20 to commemorate the return of the standards that had been lost at the Battle of Carrhae. But that only happened one time. That wasn't like a regular custom. So this festival primarily focuses on Vulcan's aspect of just being a straight up fire god. And we see this a little bit with Hephaestus as well, although mostly he's worshipped as like a craftsman god. But there are a couple of anecdotes where we see him just as a fire god. There's one version of the Prometheus story where the fire that Prometheus steals to bring to humans is the fire of Hephaestus. And then Hephaestus participates in punishing Prometheus for this by creating the chains that bind him to the rock, which is his punishment. And then the other is in the Iliad. During the Trojan War, Hephaestus sides with the Greeks, and when Achilles is being attacked by the river god, the god of the river Scamander, he's being attacked with water. The gods who are siding with the Greeks call upon Hephaestus to save Achilles using fire. So we see both iterations, Hephaestus and Vulcan, working as a fire god. And then kind of like a close relative to that is that they both are gods of volcanoes. So Vulcan obviously gives his name to volcanoes in English. There's a lot of volcanic activity in the Mediterranean anyway, so volcanoes would have been a much bigger part of their lives than they are of like my life. And there was a sense that volcanoes were the workshops of Hephaestus or Vulcan, so they were very closely connected. Mythologically, Hephaestus's favorite place on Earth was Lemnos. He spent a lot of time there. He had cult worship there, both in the mythology and in real life. He had a pretty active cult on Lemnos. But he was said to spend a lot of time there. That is itself a volcanic island. And his cult is also mentioned in Lycia, which also has a volcano, which they called Mount Chimera. So that's Hephaestus or Vulcan working as a fire god. But I think the most famous aspect that this god has is craftsmanship. This is how he's typically remembered, and this is how he's depicted in visual art as well. He has his anvil and his hammer, and in mythology, most of what he does involves some kind of creation. This is kind of like the bulk of his personality, if you will. These types of crafts were a very masculine occupation. Ancient society was much more divided by gender, and men did certain activities, and metalworking was certainly one of those activities that only men participated in, and women had other things that they did that only they participated in, primarily textile arts, if you will. That was like the main thing that women did. So Hephaestus was in charge of these manly arts, if you will, whatever you want to call them. On the feminine side of things, you had the crafts that were sacred to Athena. You had your fiber arts, your weaving, your sewing, spinning yarn, any of these types of things were all under the jurisdiction of Athena. So these two gods are connected to each other. There's evidence that sometimes their worship overlapped. They were not always, but occasionally worshipped jointly, sharing temples and festivals and things like that, kind of like sporadically. And then in the mythology, there's a story about Athens's early foundation. It's one of their foundation myths. There's a story that says that Hephaestus was interested in Athena and tried to pursue her. There's a couple different versions. So in one version, he demands to marry Athena. He asks Zeus, or basically tells Zeus, I want to marry Athena, because he was present when she was birthed and he kind of like helped in the process. He hit Zeus on the head and Athena popped out. So he felt entitled to have this connection to her. And then in the other version, he just chased her the way that Apollo chased Daphne. In both versions, she rejects him, Athena, famously virgin goddess, and one way or another, again, there's different versions, his semen landed on the earth, impregnating Gaia, and then Gaia gave birth to this guy, Erichthonius, who becomes one of the early founders of Athens. So because Hephaestus is in charge of these things, everything, like I said, from metalworking to sculpture down to like fine jewelry making, all of this is under his jurisdiction. He was especially sacred to people who were in those professions. There's a temple to him near the Agora in Athens. It's called the Hephaesteum. For people who were in these professions, it's possible that they worshipped Hephaestus at their own personal hearth or their altar in the home. We have a bunch of little statues that are really, really old, so this practice had been going on for some time. They probably would have been placed in a personal shrine or a personal hearth. As a god of crafts, Hephaestus made a lot of stuff. He made grand palaces for himself and for other gods on Mount Olympus. He made a bunch of tools and other sort of things for the gods. He made Hermes' winged sandals, for example, his winged helmet, the chariot of the sun god, stuff like that. He also made a lot of famous weapons, both for the gods and particularly for epic heroes. He made stuff for Achilles. He made stuff for Aeneas. He made a lot of mechanical stuff as well. Tools that were like semi-animate that helped him around his shop, stuff like that, which is just like so fun. I don't know, I think that's great. all these little like self-driving tripods and he made like little metal people. So he had this like guild of little metal workers that were like going around and helping him in his forge, which is awesome. There's also a story that he was the one who made Pandora. So he's responsible in a way for releasing all of these evils into the world, just as he's kind of indirectly responsible for Prometheus bringing fire and by extension technology to humans. So he's kind of like one of these primordial gods that ends up influencing human development in like a very big way. And he's always kind of working behind the scenes, right? He will participate in stories indirectly. So whenever Hermes flies around on his winged sandals, Hephaestus's work is in the background. So I want to jump to talking about some of the themes that come up in Hephaestus's mythology, starting with his parentage. So there's two strong traditions really that theorize where Hephaestus comes from. So the first is that he's the son of Zeus and Hera, kind of a straightforward explanation. And then there's the other thread that says that he is strictly the son of Hera. She gave birth to him through parthenogenesis, which is like virgin birth, possibly as revenge for Zeus giving birth to Athena, which contradicts the other story that says that Hephaestus was there when Athena was born. There's a lot of confusion in Hephaestus's lineage and his stories and stuff like that, so it's not exactly straightforward or clear. But in both versions, his mother is Hera, and in all accounts, their relationship is very contentious. The difficulties that Hephaestus has with his parents, in all accounts, are related to his physical disability. In one tradition, Hephaestus is born with physical disabilities. He has a club foot, he can't walk, etc., etc. And Hera is disgusted by this. This was a fairly common thing where if a child was born with some kind of quote-unquote defect, they would be rejected, basically. So Hera rejects Hephaestus, and she throws him off of Mount Olympus. He falls down to earth, and he is raised by some river nymphs, including Thetis, who is the mother of Achilles. In another version, Hephaestus was trying to protect Hera, actually, from his father, who was making unwanted advances on her, and as punishment, Zeus throws him off of Mount Olympus. He falls to earth and is injured, and that's why going forward he walks with a limp and he can't get around and stuff like that. Both versions have the same result, and that is that Hephaestus is disabled. He has a limp, or he can't walk, he has difficulty getting around. A lot of his epithets have to do with that. And this is another major theme of his mythology, is his disability. One thing that is pretty striking to me is the contrast between the emphasis on his disability and also the emphasis on his extraordinary ability to create things out of metal and other media, where he almost gets this superpower to be able to make his life better. I mean, a lot of his creations are things to help him get around. And it's like this direct contrast between what it is that holds him back and what it is that he's able to do to like directly solve that problem. And Hephaestus isn't the only one who has this kind of contrast. What this reminds me of is bards, poets, prophets. All of these people were kind of connected through their sort of mystical abilities. They were often depicted in Homer and elsewhere as being blind. Homer himself, Homer's not a real person, but the mythological figure of Homer himself was said to be blind. The prophet Tiresias was blind. The logic is that the gods took away their sight in real life in exchange for giving them this kind of true sight through which they can create poetry or deliver oracles and stuff like that. It also reminds me of the way that people thought about epilepsy in antiquity. It was called the sacred disease, and people who had it were thought to be somehow like extra blessed by the gods or sacred to the gods. So they had this kind of like physical impediment, but it made them especially holy. Hephaestus reminds me of all of these types of things where there's this like give and take between what holds you back and then what your superpower is. I want to come back for a second to this initial moment when Hera throws Hephaestus off Mount Olympus because of his disability. This is at least, one of those threads. Because this is the first time that Hephaestus is rejected. And we will see, I have a few examples here. Hephaestus is rejected over and over again in his life, and he responds to it in a very particular way. He does the same thing like each time it happens. So after Hera throws Hephaestus off Mount Olympus, the rest of the story goes like this. He never forgave her. He never really forgot what she had done to him. And so as he's developing his craft and as he is living his life, he kind of ruminates on this, and he decides that he's going to do something about it. So he makes all of these gifts for the gods, as he generally does, and one of the gifts that he gives is a chair for his mother to sit in. And he sends it up with all of the other gifts. But when Hera sits in it, it traps her. You can see in the depiction here, there's like chains or handcuffs or something that keep her bound to the chair. She can't get up, and all of the gods are trying to help her, and none of them can. So Zeus tries to get Hephaestus to come back to Olympus and free his mother, but Hephaestus is not really interested in doing that. So Zeus declares that any god who could bring Hephaestus back would win Aphrodite in marriage. It's like a random thing that he decides. And Aphrodite actually agrees to this. She gives consent, and the reason she does that is because she believes that her lover, Ares, the god of war, is the obvious winner of any sort of contest of brute strength. So she says, he's obviously going to win, so then we can get married and it's going to be fine. So she signs on to this project. And Ares immediately goes down to Hephaestus's workshop and yells at him and threatens him, and Hephaestus drives him off with flaming projectiles and big balls of fire and all of that stuff. So Ares actually has to retreat. So he loses the contest. The next god to try is Dionysus. And there's two different versions of the Dionysus story. In one version, he just gets Hephaestus drunk and brings him back to Mount Olympus. But in another version, he tells Hephaestus that if he goes back of his own accord, then he is actually the one who brought he himself back. So he would win the contest himself, and then he himself, Hephaestus, would get to marry Aphrodite. And Hephaestus likes this idea, and he does it, and so he wins Aphrodite in marriage, which was not what Aphrodite had planned. So the first thing that Aphrodite does as Hephaestus' wife is cheat on him with Ares. As soon as Hephaestus leaves town, he goes to Lemnos, which is like his favorite place. Aphrodite immediately invites Ares over, brings him to their marital bed, and they are cheating on Hephaestus. They think they're going to get away with this, but they forget that Helios is the sun god. He sees everything, and he is friends with Hephaestus. Remember, Hephaestus made his chariot, etc., etc. So he immediately tells Hephaestus everything, and Hephaestus is pissed. This is the second time that Hephaestus gets rejected. He's so upset about this, and he basically does the same thing in this instance that he did with his mother. He goes to his workshop and he comes up with some kind of creation that will help him take revenge on the people who wronged him. With Hera, it was the chair, and this is what he does with Aphrodite. He goes to his workshop and he creates this super fine net out of bronze. It's so fine that it's like invisible to the naked eye. And he strings it up in his bed. And then he tells his wife, oh, I'm going back to Lemnos, or I'm going somewhere else, and he leaves her alone, and the first thing she does is immediately invites Ares over, and they get into bed together once again. But this time, they are trapped in Hephaestus's net, and they're stuck, they can't move. And it turns out Hephaestus did not go back to Lemnos. He went straight to the Council of the Gods, to Zeus and the others, and he tells them everything that happened, and he invites them back to his house, to his bedroom, to see for themselves what Aphrodite and Ares had done to him. So the gods go and they see them caught in this net, so they're all laughing, and then they say, okay, yeah, no, it's very funny, you can let him go now. And Hephaestus is like, I am not letting them go. I'm not going to let them go until Zeus pays me back all of the gifts that I gave him as bridal gifts for Aphrodite. And there's some back and forth, and Poseidon steps in and says, you know what, Ares is my friend, I'll cover you, I'll pay you back what you're owed, just let them go. And so Hephaestus ends up letting them go after that. If you've heard a story about Hephaestus from Greek mythology, this is the one that you've heard, probably. It comes out of the Odyssey. It's one of the most influential myths about Hephaestus. It's depicted all over the place, and it really shows another instance where Hephaestus was able to use his crafts to take revenge on people that had done him wrong. So after that, they get divorced. I don't think there's any coming back from that. Aphrodite goes on and lives her life. Hephaestus goes on and lives his life, has other marriages, other children. But it turns out that as a result of Aphrodite cheating on him with Ares, Aphrodite is now pregnant. One tradition says that the child is Eros, god of desire and passion and stuff like that. And another tradition says that the child is Harmonia. Harmonia goes on to marry Cadmus, stay with me, I promise it'll pay off, who is the founder of the Cadmean line, which culminates with Oedipus. When Cadmus and Harmonia get married, Hephaestus gives Harmonia this beautiful necklace that is finely crafted, all of the usual praise for Hephaestus's work, but the necklace is cursed. Hephaestus, for the last time, is getting revenge on his wife for cheating on him by cursing her progeny, giving her this necklace that in turn curses the whole Cadmean line down to Oedipus, and we all know what happens to Oedipus, so it's a pretty bad curse. This is the last time that Hephaestus gets revenge. I really like these stories, the last couple of stories that I've been talking about, not because I'm in favor of revenge, but because I like how Hephaestus uses all of the tools he has at his disposal to stick up for himself in a way that I would never personally do myself. And I like it especially because it ties together these two aspects of fire. He makes these beautiful, incredible things. He makes this super fine net. He makes this gorgeous necklace, but it's cursed. All of these things are beautiful and they're a demonstration of his skill as a craftsman, but they also all cause harm. They represent both of the creative and destructive aspects of fire itself, and that is fundamentally what this god is about. He can create, he can destroy, he can produce life, give life, support life, and also take it away. He's extraordinarily helpful, but he's very dangerous, and you don't want to get on his bad side. That is the fundamental nature of this god, in my opinion. But I would love to know what you think about Hephaestus and Vulcan. Anything of the themes that we talked about, any thoughts that you have about this god after hearing these stories, or maybe you have some that I didn't mention and you'd like to share. If you found this video helpful, if you thought it was interesting, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you like this kind of content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I post stuff like this all the time. And thank you so much for watching. I really, truly appreciate you. I'm happy to be making videos again. So I will see you very soon in the next video.